Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, featuring speakers from our 2017 event. This podcast features Brent Elliott from the Canadian Grain Commission, and his podcast is called Protect the Quality of Your Stored Grain from Insect Infestations.
I can't see any of you, so I may move up there and see you better at some point. We'll see how the feedback works with this. What wasn't mentioned in my bio, I probably provided that and it was kind of inefficient. I've actually been working in agriculture for a fairly long time, and I've run into a few people here at this event that reminded me just how long it is. I taught some people here over 25 years ago, and that sort of terrified me, but it is what it is. We just keep moving on. I'm not going to talk too much about pathology. We're going to talk about entomology. We're going to talk about bugs. Bugs are more fun. We're going to talk about a number of different things. Just so you know, I'm going to walk. Got all these lights shining at me. It's kind of scary. We'll see where the feedback goes. I like seeing up here anyway. The other thing is I've been told before that I have a face for radio, so it's probably, too far. Probably better if I'm up here and you're looking at the screen instead of me. So we'll talk about some things today. We'll talk a bit about legislation because I don't know how many of you are delivering grain and you get to the elevator, somebody comes back to you and says, no, you got bugs, I'm rejecting it. They're actually allowed to do that. They're not just making up stories and don't want your grain. We'll talk about grain storage itself, all the aspects of it, not just as a unit. Sometimes we talk to people and they just go, oh no, it's good, I put it in the bin, it's safe, it's fine. No, it's a living organism. The whole thing is got all sorts of things going on. And then we'll talk about insect pests, we'll talk about specific ones for you, and we'll talk about some control and management, which of course is obviously the most important stuff. So, big wordy slide for you. This is always a bad thing to put in a presentation, but we'll just use it this way, and there we are. Okay, the numbers, if you're really, really curious and you're into reading government legislation, I don't know anyone that is, but it exists. Those are the exact parts of the act that are relevant. Basically, what this one says here is that grain elevator shall not accept infested grain. So if they're rejecting your grain, they're following the act, okay? If they have infested grain themselves, they're not supposed to discharge it. So they have to follow regulations on that side as well. So they're not supposed to be shipping it out. Last one, that actually pertains to you guys as growers. If your grain is infested, you're actually not supposed to deliver it to a facility. Now, I can guarantee you 100% nobody from the Grain Commission is going to come to you and say, hey, you delivered infested grain. We don't have the bodies, it's not the way it is. It's just to try and provide some sort of semblance of organization for the whole thing. Now, in my job, I talk to a lot of different groups from all around the world, actually. I talk to people from Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, a lot of Asian nations, and we give them the presentation and we talk to them about the grain flow pattern in Canada. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess all of you know this better than I do. Grain comes from the farm, goes out to the country elevators, moved generally by rail to our ports, moved out of the country by ship to China, to Europe, to Russia on occasion. The point of this slide for you guys is that the easiest place to manage insects is on farm. Every time we make that grain bulk bigger, it's harder and more expensive to control. So unfortunately, the pressure all falls back onto the farmer. In terms of rail cars, just as a side note, you really can't control insects in a rail car. So if somebody tells you they want to fumigate your rail car and they want to bill you for it, I would suggest you reject that notion because it's not going to do anything anyway. When we fumigate, we need to have basically as good a seal on our system as we can. In a rail car, all that gas is just going to go out. It's just going to leave. The bugs are going to survive. It's not good. Now, with all of these structures that we have, if I go back, right, we've all got the same basic shape except for the rail car. We'll take it out. Every one of these systems has grain in it, right? But we also have air currents in there. And if we're talking about winter, we're talking about right now, we've got cold grain, we've got air moving through here, moves into that warm core, just convection currents, nothing more. We end up with situations with high moisture and a warm core of grain. Grain, of course, is a fabulous insulator, right? If we could use it in our houses without it going rotten, we might, but we don't, obviously. So it stays very warm in that core. My pathologists all left on me. It's quite sad. I actually put this in just for their benefit. You get storage molds in there. We don't want storage molds for two reasons. One, obviously, it reduces the quality of your grain. Second reason is it will attract insects that will infest the grain further. They'll happily feed on the mold. They will not feed on the grain, but they're quite content there. And when you take that into the elevator again, I'm not sure that anyone's going to actually tell you exactly what the species of insect is. They just found a bug. They don't want your grain anymore. Now, in that grain bin that you have, and this doesn't matter whether it's winter or it's summer, right? This is the whole year we're going on. We've got our grains in there. We've got dockage in there. That's fine. We've got the gases in there. We said they're moving around. We've got all sorts of bacterial and small other things in there. We've got mites. We've got insects, fungi, and water vapor. All of it provides a wonderful environment for things to live and grow, okay? Bugs most notably. You've also got other things going on outside. You've got the outside temperature. Pretty warm this week. Would have been better for me if we were talking about this last week when it was really freezing cold all across the prairies. Cold is good. But in there, so you've got your grain. We've got three main issues we have. Storage molds, again, someone had mentioned vomitoxin. We've got those issues going on, potential there. Weed seeds, I won't talk about a lot about weed seeds today, but I will give you a heads up that from a Canadian Grain Commission perspective, we look at weed seeds a lot more closely than we used to, mostly because they're becoming trade barriers. There's a lot of countries that are specifying, hey, you know, I don't want cleavers in my shipments, that sort of thing. So you may start hearing more about weed seeds in the future from that. But being a bug guy, I would like to talk about insects. Insects are obviously important for a number of reasons. The most important reason, they can be really, really damaging. This is lesser grain borer, 20 adults, 10 boys, 10 girls, 2 months at 30 degrees Celsius. It's an experimental temperature we typically use, fair enough, but 30 degrees Celsius can happen in your bins pretty easily, right? Most of you will have temperature probes, yes, I assume so. You've been in there. If you harvest late or in the fall, it's nice warm. September, say we get the grain off, that would be a good year probably. Your grain might go in there at 35 degrees. Fair enough? Okay? That's 2 months. Your grain core will still stay very, very, very warm until the fall and even into this time of year. So in terms of insects, where do they come from? How do we detect them? That identification stuff. Sometimes you need to control your insects, sometimes you don't. It depends what it is and how we manage it. What's a primary, what's a secondary insect, and we'll talk about all sorts of other things with them. So, where do they come from? Everybody goes, well, my neighbor has insects in his bin, right? Okay, fair enough, it's your neighbor, it's not you, this is good. Some of them overwinter here. They do really, really well in cold temperatures, okay? They're here, they're happy as long as they've got a warm grain source. Even the grain piles out front here, if there's enough snow cover, they can survive the winter down there. Rusties are really cold tolerant. Got a couple of them that are migrants, the red flower beetle, the lesser grain borer. Those ones fly in, so if you're thinking, you know, if you're talking in terms of field crops, if you come see John Gawlowski talk later, maybe he'll talk about diamondback moth, something that blows in during the season. These guys will do the same thing. They'll blow in during the summer, and some of them even come in during harvest. Foreign grain beetle, not a big problem in terms of your grain, but your grain dealer may mistake it for a rusty grain beetle and reject your grain on that basis. That's kind of a problem. Foreign grain beetles are just fungal feeders. They don't want anything to do with your grain. They're just feeding on the spores that are on your grain. They happen to be in your field of cereal at harvest. They're there, you've got some spotting on your stem or maybe a little bit on the head, that sort of thing. They're basically there cleaning it off, but they end up getting harvested, going through the combine and into your bin. So they end up with bugs in your bin. Not where we want to go. So I talked to Réjean Picard, who gave me the invite to talk here, and I've talked to Scott Hartley out in Saskatchewan, a little bit to John Gawlowski as well. And it seems like the big issue this year was storing grain over summer, okay? From my perspective, and understand, and I am aware that I am not a farmer, I am not dealing with grain and trying to get my best dollar for it, so fair enough. I will only tell you that it is a risky thing to do in the sense of many of our storage pests are free-flying. I talked about red flower beetle, talked about lesser grain borer, they will fly in, they will find your bin. Your bin is giving off, sorry, not your bin, your grain is giving off odors. They will find it on that basis. Higher humidity. If you don't pay attention to your bin during the summer, you've got a little bit of storage mold going in there, you'll get a lot of secondary pests getting in there as well, okay, sosids or mites. And it's much, much harder to manage a bin full of grain from an insect management standpoint in the summer, simply because aeration, one of the main tools we use during the winter, or should be using during the winter, isn't there anymore, okay? We talk about overwintering, right? Flea beetles will overwinter, they'll come out, they'll feed on your canola in the spring as it's a seedling. If you happen to have potatoes, Colorado potato beetle overwinters very well in our windrows of trees under the snow. Well, a lot of our grain pests will oversummer very, very well in your bins. If that grain core is warm through the winter, they will survive quite happily, and you're retaining it in the summer, all of your grain will now warm up. They're quite happy, so they're just going to party harder in the summer for you, okay? Detecting insect populations, lots of different ways to do it. You can use pitfall traps like this with an electronic sensor. They're kind of neat in the sense that they will just count insects as they fall by the sensor. They won't tell you what's in there, so you can't be sure if you're having a problem. We can use pheromone traps of all sorts. We can use probe traps, basically a pitfall type of trap to sample the grain, pull them out, and then sieve them, okay? Same deal with the grain triers here. There's a booth over here, I don't know who it is, but they're selling the grain triers there. I'm sure everybody has them. Looks like we've moved away from brass into stainless steel probably now. Temperature probes. I'm sure you guys are all using temperature probes, and that's a fantastic thing. I think it's absolutely wonderful. The reason is that insects, when they get into larger groups, will actually create hotspots in your grain. So if you've managed your grain, you've had your aeration on the fall, you've got that temperature down. If you've got temperature probes through your bin, or you're actually probing it for the temperature, you find a hot spot, that's probably a good indication that you've got insects in there as well. In terms of what we use at the Grain Commission and what many of the elevators will use these things called Berlese funnels. Basically, you've got a funnel, you put a screen in the bottom, put the grain on there, put it on top of a jar, under the light drives the insects down. It's a remarkable tool. Problem is, it takes about 6 hours to get all the insects out of there. So it's time consuming. Sieves, again, sieves are for sale around here. I've seen them at 1 or 2 places. Fabulous tools, and from talking with I tend to talk to people at elevators more than I do individual farmers, which is kind of unfortunate. But I do talk to the elevator staff a fair bit, and they say that lots of you guys actually have sieves on your trucks. You're checking for your insects on your own, which is great. Check it and go that way. From our perspective at the Canadian Grain Commission, we talk about primary versus secondary insects. Primary insects are directly feeding on the grain. Okay, these are your main pests that we're dealing with. These are the bad bugs we don't like. Many will feed internally as larvae, and we should control those as grain owners very quickly. These are your rusty grain beetles, your red flower beetle, and your weevils, okay? Now, mentioned very early on, I talked about that legislation. And when you go to an elevator, in an idealized situation, they can tell between a primary and a secondary insect, okay? If they can do that, that's a better situation for you, but not everybody knows their insects all that well. They should only reject your grain on the basis of primary insects being there. If it's a rusty grain beetle, yes, they should reject it. Red flower beetle, yes, they should reject it. If it's a secondary insect, they're really not going to survive very long in grain that's in good condition. So they shouldn't really be rejecting you on that basis. But again, it's a question of identifying these things, and I will actually show you pictures of these in a few seconds. Secondary insects feed on grain that's already damaged or going out of condition. They're generally an indicator that there's already a problem going on. Something's wrong. They're usually mold feeders, or they came in with harvest and they're feeding on the mold, that sort of thing. If you can get your grain into good condition, and by good condition, reasonable moisture content, relatively low temperature, these things will just disappear on you. You don't need to spray for them, you don't need to fumigate, that sort of thing. Should be okay. Foreign grain beetle is in there, moths, mites, that sort of stuff. Primary insects, these guys are all small, right? One of the other great things about getting older is your eyesight starts going. I see lots of glasses up there. I have glasses there in my pocket. I'm a little vain, I guess. One of the nice things, and I don't know if you ever noticed this, but if you ever watch other entomologists talk, and I used to do this when I was dealing with horticulture, is we'd put a picture up of the insect with absolutely nothing in the background to give you a size of scale. So you've got this insect that's this large. No, not really. Grain kernels, right? About 5 millimeters, quarter inch, whatever you want to call it, long. These are our primary insects here. This is our granary weevil and our rice weevil. Rice weevil is a really dumb name. It does feed on rice, but it's very, very happy on wheat. Red flower beetle and confused flower beetle, lesser grain borer, sawtooth grain beetle, foreign grain beetle, and rusty grain beetle. These two here, to me, don't look anything the same. They're similar in color. They're brown, they're small, that sort of thing. But to me, when I look at them, they're very, very different. Now, this is a foreign grain beetle. I mentioned it a couple of times. The reason I mention it is simply because it's a very important insect in the sense that you probably get your grain rejected at the elevator, or your neighbor does, however that works. If you've ever taken it in, it may be that insect that's doing it. It's a secondary pest. It doesn't even feed on grain. But it also comes in to your bins during harvest. Okay? If your grain is warm through the winter before you get it to delivery, it'll be quite happy, it'll be quite content, it'll feed on whatever little spores are on that grain, and then you'll get a rejection on the basis of it. Because if you take it there, most of the grain guys at the elevators don't have resources, they can't really tell these two apart. It looks very much like a rusty. They see it, it's a tiny little beetle, 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters long, looks like a rusty. You got bugs in your grain, see you later. Not good. Don't want that. That's the foreign grain beetle here. That's the rusty grain beetle here. Okay, rusties. From all of the information we have at the Canadian Grain Commission, that accounts for 95% of the insect detections across Canada. Okay? Rusty grain beetle, our #1 pest by a wide, wide, wide margin. The reason for it is it is super, super cold tolerant. Okay? It can withstand temperatures down to minus 20 degrees Celsius for about a week. Okay? So it takes a long time to kill that sucker if it's in your grain. Thankfully, they don't do that much at colder temperatures. Red flower beetles probably are #2. We don't see it very often, maybe 2%, 2.5% of our detections. It's round, it's a bit of a more voracious feeder, but it's not a big deal for us. This guy down here in the bottom left on either screen is the lesser grain borer. It's kind of interesting from a Canadian Grain Commission perspective. We did a research project with Kansas State University, where this is a pretty big pest down in Kansas, Oklahoma. So they were looking for insects from Canada to check for phosphine resistance. So we went looking for it, and we find it very rarely in Canada, maybe 1, 2, 3 detections out of all the grain we ship out of Canada. And so we thought, well, okay, we'll go looking for it for you, but we're not going to find it. So we set up a bunch of traps, and in that first year, we set up about 6 traps, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. We found it in 5 of 6 traps. Now, we were pretty close to the US border, and we know it gets blown in with the wind, and we thought, well, okay, fair enough. It's around, we'll see what happens with it. Went back the next year, we figured we'd go a little further north. First year, we were pretty close to that US border. This second year, we went pretty much along the Trans-Canada through the 3 prairie provinces again. We found it in 13 of 14 of our traps. I was like, wow, yeah, things around here a little more than we thought. So third year, which was this past summer, we went looking for this pest, and we thought, well, okay, let's see how far north this thing goes. So we basically followed the Yellowhead, right? It's not the best way to do insect distribution, but hey, I'm the guy driving around setting up the traps, collecting. You got to follow the highways more or less. So we were up as far as Kindersley, Bigger. You know, if you're from Manitoba, we were up. I guess our furthest north trap was Dauphin. Good news is there is actually apparently a northern distribution point for this insect. It pretty much stops around the #1, maybe a little bit north of the #1. I guess a fair bit north of the #1, half hour. We did find it in Minnedosa. We did not find it in Dauphin. So, you know, Minnedosa, we didn't find it in Yorkton. Anybody from Saskatchewan here? Or is this all Manitoba I'm talking to here? Okay, I'll stop talking about Saskatchewan. Sorry about that. Anyway, it's around. It's that picture I showed at the start with that jar with all that damage in there. It is a super voracious feeder. Good news is it doesn't like cold. Doesn't do well here. It'll die out over the winter. blow back in the spring. But if it gets in your bin and your bin core stays warm, not going to be a good situation for you. So foreign grain beetle, again, just really super confused with these guys. In terms of identifying this stuff, I'll flog our website a little bit. This is Canadian Grain Commission. If you've ever gone looking for a Canadian Grain Commission website, you will notice that the URL for everything in any government organization, Canada, US, Europe, whatever, you can't memorize those things. They're way too long and annoying. So Google is your friend. We have a ton of information on insects on there. It's accessible on your phone as well. This is actually formatted to work on your phone, so it's good. We have lists of the insects, so if you want to find a particular insect, you want to look up information about a rusty or a lesser grain borer or whatever it is, that's great, that's all there. And we also have insect identification keys that we've put up there. I'm sure you've seen these for canola insects, or I don't know what else John will, or Scott out in Saskatchewan will have done, but there will be insect keys around that you'll have used to identify these insects. And basically, you're always making a choice. We've got two choices for you to make in a key. Pretty simple stuff. And in fact, when we developed this key a number of years ago, we actually ran it through a bunch of kindergarten kids, and they did really well with it. And then we took it sort of to the next level, and we ran it through some government employees, and they got it too. So pretty much everybody can handle it. But very simple questions. Is it a moth? Is it not a moth? Hey, I can answer that one. You just click on the picture where you want to go, or click on the button here, and it'll take you on to a bunch of information. You just run it through the key, and you'll eventually get to a pest. So it tells you the pest name. Not that you want to know the scientific name, but it's there. Description, a bunch of images so you can make those pictures bigger, sort of stuff. All this information, plus a whole bunch of other stuff on the side. So it's a relatively useful tool, we've been told. But you're more concerned with controlling these things, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways to do this. And some of these do fit under organic. Is anybody here organic or know anybody organic? No? Mostly conventional? Okay, good. You have more options under conventional, which is sort of why it's a little easier to do. So, sanitation. Every job I've ever had in entomology has always had me telling people to clean things up. And it's no different in grain storage. And this is, we're talking when your bins are empty, okay? In my old job, I used to deal with livestock as well. Always have problems with flies in bins, that sort of thing, right? What's the first thing you gotta do when you have flies in your barn? Clean it up, right? Lots of manure, it's there, that's what they're feeding on, then they annoy the hell out of the animals. Same thing with bins. This food here, this is a very old picture. I was actually probably not even born when this one was taken. Out of this little bit here, they collected 200 rusty grain beetles, okay? That's a summer bin, it's empty, it's just the debris over the old doorway, all right? So tons and tons of insects. If you think about rusty grain beetles, or at least as an entomologist, I think about rusty grain beetles and I go, okay, reproductive capacity over the life of a single female beetle, she'll lay 1,500 eggs, okay? Ballpark 200, say half of them are female, it's 100, 1,500. I don't do math real well, that's a whole lot of beetles, right? In a very short period of time. That's about 4 months if your grain is warm, that they'll get to those numbers. Just crazy. So clean your bins thoroughly. You're probably doing it already, you're blowing it out. I don't know if anybody's vacuuming it out, sweeping it out, whatever it is. Probably the air compressor blowing it out, it's better to get that sort of stuff out there. Don't know how many people use diatomaceous earth, or DE, as a dust. You can dust those empty bins. It works really well over the summer. The DE works by being an abrasive on the insects. They rub against it, rubs off their waxy cuticle, and they basically dry out and die. So it works very, very well in empty bins. Very big fan of it that way. Diatomaceous earth, a little harder to use with actual grain. It's hard to get the right application amount on there. If you get too much, it'll reduce flowability, right? Might change your test weight too. So it can be a little bit iffy that way. But basically, taking this approach, cleaning up your bin, once it's empty, prevents those insects from over-summering in your bin, right? In terms of bin construction, maybe a couple years ago when we had all that grain, maybe wood bins would still be helpful. Still better than leaving it lying on the ground if that was the case. Obviously, we've got grain bags now, which is better than just leaving it on the ground. But not a lot of wood bins around anymore. Does anybody have a neighbor that have wood bins anymore? No? A few lying out there, maybe not in good shape, yeah. Basically, your more modern bins, I was over looking at the bins in the the far end down there, and wow, they get big now, don't they? That's absolutely incredible how huge those are. Took a picture of these a couple of years ago, and I was just floored at how large those things are. Obviously, you want to have aeration on these things if you can. Critical concern for managing your grain, certainly over the winter. Very important. Those winter temperatures we had last week, did anybody have their aeration on last week? Cool down their grain? No? Too bad. Good time for it. Really cold is a really good time for it. Right now, not so great. Certainly you can still cool your bin if your probes or your temperature gauges are showing that you've got a hot spot. Still useful to aerate right now. And in terms of aeration, what I'm talking about is specifically managing insects. There's a lot of other considerations for aeration, and I'm not going to go over those. I understand there are issues where people talk about aeration and talking about adding moisture into the bin. Absolutely, that's a possibility. I'm not talking about that at this point, and I'm not talking about it from managing that. I'm just talking about it from managing insect situations. For aeration, as soon as it's in the bin, aeration makes sense in relatively low humidity periods, just to reduce that post-harvest heat that's in that bin, right? Again, you harvest, if we have a really nice year, we harvest in August, it's 35 degrees outside, you're putting your grain in that bin, it's 35 degrees in the bin too. And it's going to retain that heat really, really well. So you want to, if you get a little cooler at night, you get down to 20, maybe you can start dropping that temperature earlier on. Equalize that moisture gradient throughout the bin. Yeah, absolutely, it's something we want to do. You don't want wet spots in there if you can have it. And if we get it cool enough, we can start preventing insect reproduction and feeding. You might not kill all the insects, but you can certainly stop them from getting worse. Okay? So in terms of moving that moisture through, don't really worry too much about all the details here with the cone, how the top of the grain is. Basically, you want to push that air through enough to the point where you basically get cool and dry grain all the way throughout, right? What's cool and dry? Well, target temperature in the fall, you want to match the outdoor ambient air temperature as best you can. Obviously, if it jumps up to 37 after you've harvested, you're not going to be real keen on matching that air temperature. But we're talking about, September, we start getting cooler nights, we get it down, 10, 15 degrees Celsius. That's reasonable to aim for. And eliminate that temperature differential that drive those air currents from that picture I showed earlier. In winter, you want to reduce the grain temperature below 18 degrees Celsius. Okay? Not a huge drop from anything. Now, don't measure on the outside of the bins, right? We all know the grain's a good insulator. Outside's going to be cold. Measure your core. Look for hot spots if you're probing in different places, right? You want to have a uniform temperature below 18 degrees Celsius. Below 18 degrees Celsius, basically all of the grain insects that we have in a bin will stop doing much of anything. They're certainly not going to be reproducing. They'll reduce their feeding. Some of them may even start dying around that temperature. Not all of them are very cold hardy. Ideal grain temperature during your winter storage period is 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, okay? That's not going to kill rusty grain beetle. It's going to kill pretty much everything else. It'll kill your reds, it'll kill your lesser grain borer. If you got mites, foreign grain beetle, it'll kill all of that stuff. 5 to 10 though, very nice, even low temperature, not going to have insect problems going into the spring. Obviously those factors affecting aeration time, I'm not going to talk about. I'm not an engineer. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that, your bin size, your fan size, all that sort of stuff, even the grain that's in there. There are good calculations. I've seen them out on the web, whether they're from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Minnesota, that sort of stuff. Rusty grain beetle, I cannot emphasize enough. It is our number one pest. It's number one pest for a reason. If your grain temperature is minus 5 degrees Celsius, it takes 12 weeks to kill the rusties, okay? 12 weeks. If you found rusties, it's a long, long time. Even at minus 20 degrees Celsius, so last week, if you're aerating all last week, you got your grain temperature down to minus 20, you probably killed all the rusties. But that's minus 20. 5 degrees warmer, talking about a month now, okay? Very difficult to manage that pest. Grain vacuators can be used too, for sure. That's more summer reactivity. They're all right. They do kill the insects. They move in the grain flow. It bashes around. If you get too big a tube, though, that grain just moves as a liquid, and the insects just flow through it, and they don't get bashed up and crushed up either. So not too big, just the right size. If you don't have aeration on your bin, one of the recommendations we make when we get phone calls to guys is, hey, just auger it out of the bin, right? Auger it out of the bin into the truck. That, ironically, is corn. Better talk for Southern Ontario, I guess. Basically, that'll break up the hot spots. It'll cool down the grain a fair bit. You're probably not going to get a lot of mortality just by moving it out into the truck for a day or two when it's cold, but you'll break up all those hot spots, get a nice even temperature, and you'll stop all that reproduction. So it's a very useful way to do things if you've got a bin without aeration. Chemical control. Now we're starting to talk a bit about summer here, okay? Not a lot of products registered in Canada for insect control on your grain, certainly not as a spray that you'd apply. Malathion, depending on who you talk to, they will tell you that, oh, malathion is absolutely useless because there's a lot of resistance in the stored grain insects to malathion, right? Now, years ago when I worked for Manitoba Agriculture, I used to work in potatoes, and we'd talk about aphids in potatoes. And malathion was a product that didn't work in aphids in potatoes. Fair enough. And everybody go, oh, it's resistance, but nobody ever checked to see if it was resistance. What it is it's an artifact of the old regulatory system where when they registered a product, malathion was registered, man, probably back in the 40s, they used to just throw things on the label and then go, okay, yeah, fair enough, and never actually test whether it worked on them. So I don't know in Manitoba whether malathion just doesn't work on our stored grain insects or whether there's actual resistance issues. But pretty much everybody you talk to that's been around for a very long time says it does not work well. Pyrethrins are okay. These products are registered in the US, they are not in Canada. That's probably a familiar story to you. If you grow crops in this country, you will see often lots of registrations in the US first, then they'll come into Canada, probably on the horticulture crops as they're a higher value crop, and they make it to our cereals and oilseeds last. Chlorantraniliprole, probably sometime in the future too, but don't hold your breath. Fumigants, methylbromide, don't even think about it anymore. It's basically gone. There's about 200 pounds of it left in Canada. Destroys the ozone layer. Bad thing. Phosphine. Anybody use phosphine tablets, phostoxin? Know their neighbor does, that sort of thing? Okay. Phostoxin, definitely around. Concerns on a global scale about resistance. I mentioned that stuff we did with Kansas State. That was actually to look for resistance. Good news is all the populations we tested across the Canadian prairies, we don't appear to have phosphine resistance in the Canadian prairies at this time. Good thing. Carbon dioxide, not really used on a farm scale, is used at some elevators, some of our port elevators in Vancouver. There's a couple that actually just use carbon dioxide alone. Carbon dioxide would fit under organic standards, probably, if you were that type of grower, which would be great. I will caution you too, though, that carbon dioxide is pretty much about as dangerous as phosphine. Can't breathe carbon dioxide, right? So we have guys going in elevators where there's carbon dioxide. If they don't have carbon dioxide sensors, people do die from carbon dioxide too. So it's not harmless, even though it's quote-unquote natural. When you apply tablets, Manitoba for sure, you need to be a licensed applicator, or you need to have a neighbor that's a licensed applicator to apply phosphine now. Phostoxin, gas toxin, aluminum phosphide, magnesium phosphide, whichever name you're using, pretty much all the same stuff. Your grain temperature needs to be above 10 degrees Celsius, okay? If your grain temperature is not above 10 degrees Celsius, those tablets will not oxidize and liberate the gas properly. They will sit there in a semi-solid state and they will release it later on. And when they do that, it might be when you open the top of the bin to check how things are going and you get a face full of phosphine, right? Very serious health issue. Do not want anybody to die. That's not a good thing. We don't like that. So there's that licensed applicator stuff. Does anybody seal their bins when they use phostoxin, phosphine, whichever? No, it's not a big thing in Canada. It's absolutely not. Generally, we tuck some tablets into the bin, we put them on a belt in an elevator, that sort of thing. The Australians, because they have a very, very different situation than we do, we obviously have all this cold around us for months at a time. Australians never get that cold, so they have very serious issues with phosphine resistance. How are we doing for time? 10 minutes? Thank you. We're cruising along good. Australians have found that when they aren't sealing their bins, they're essentially not fumigating. What happens is you put the tablets in there, the phosphine liberates, you've got the gas going out, but all it does, it just goes up and then out the top of the bin or out holes wherever it is in the bin. So they have that phrase that's up on the screen for you. Yeah, to an extent they're absolutely right, and certainly in their situation it's far more critical. Although we're getting to that point in North America, what we tend to watch is what happens in Kansas and Oklahoma, the southern states, where they're a fair bit warmer than we are. Not quite as warm as Australia, but definitely warmer than what we see in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And they're starting to see that without sealing bins, their fumigations are pretty much useless now. So if that bit of resistance that they have down there starts creeping its way further north, we may be sealing bins at some point. Actually went around the show booths here looking to see if anybody was selling anything for sealing bins, and the answer right now is no. So not a big concern. So you're not alone if you're not sealing your bin, but perhaps something to consider going forward. The reason for that, the science behind it, and I'm an entomologist, I can't do a presentation without a graph. At time here, the phosphine concentration here. Essentially, you need to have this effective concentration reached, and if you've got unsealed bins, it's going out wherever the openings are, it's never actually getting to that effective concentration. Now, as we sit in Manitoba with our populations of insects that aren't phosphine resistant, we're okay. We're still probably hitting them here. They're getting a lethal dose, they're dying, you're doing what you're supposed to do. That's good. If you're talking about an Australian or a Kansas, Oklahoma situation, you really do need to hit beyond here, and you can only do that by sealing the bins. So again, thoughts going forward, whether you're going to do that or not. In terms of how to manage these things going forward, hey, if your temperatures are below 20 degrees Celsius outside, use aeration to cool it down, okay? It's sensible, it's fairly easy to do. You cool your grain if it's harvested hot, create that uniform temperature profile to minimize those air currents moving through there, reduces your hot spots, reduces your wet spots too on the top of your grain, okay? It's a good way to go on that sort of idea. Below that 18 degrees Celsius, insect reproduction stops. You're not killing all the insects, but they're not making babies, right? They're not having more, there's not more insects coming along, and it will also minimize their feeding. 18 degrees Celsius, pretty easy target to hit, okay? You could go and turn on your bins for probably a couple of days right now, as long as you get that air front all the way through to the top of the bin. If you're pushing it through from the bottom, you're probably going to hit that even when it's, -1, +2, whatever it is. So you can get your aeration on, get it that way if you've got hot spots. You'll at least stop that insect feeding. You'll kill some of the insects that don't survive well at that. If your temperatures are above 10 degrees Celsius, I'm talking grain temperature here, you can certainly use chemical control. Obviously, that's not going to be a great option right now. I've mentioned hot spots, I've mentioned the warm core in the bin. Yeah, absolutely, those temperatures could be above that 10 degrees Celsius. I would caution you against putting phosphine tablets in there at this point, simply because if they shift in the grain, they move around to a cold spot, again, come spring, you might have that liberation of gas at that time. So we don't like seeing phosphine being used in winter. Certainly once we warm up in the spring, that sort of stuff, absolutely. First thing is if you're retaining your grain, I've worked in agriculture now for 20 years, was at the university for 5. You guys are busy, okay? There's lots going on. Obviously, just seeing the first 2 presentations earlier today, sclerotinia issues, disease issues, all that sort of stuff. There's the whole weed management regime that you guys have to go through, field scouting, equipment repair, all that sort of stuff. You're busy, I get that. But don't forget about that bin that you've got, that you left the grain in because you're waiting for a better price or whatever it is, you didn't have time to get it to delivery, however that works. Check it every 2 to 4 weeks. We suggest 2. That's maybe not realistic for you. Once a month, certainly go look for it. In the summer, you're going to have that grain warm up again. Once that grain's warmed up, those insects are getting happier again. So if you didn't kill them all, you're just managing them, they weren't reproducing, now they're getting happier, now they're moving around, now they're finding friends and chatting, okay? So they're gonna have babies. Sanitation, clean those bins. Now we're obviously not talking about summer storage of wheat, or cereal, sorry, or anything. Sanitation, clean those bins as best you can. Again, make it part of your routine. Aeration in the fall, reduce that field heat. Gets a little bit drier. I'm not getting into the whole discussion about drying grain by using aeration. There's better ways to do that. And manage your insect populations when it's cold enough. Certainly if you go back after this and you check your bins, you find some insects, we're supposed to get cold again in about a week, hey, pop on your aeration at that time. Pretty easy to do. Fumigate, absolutely. Fumigation is an option we need to do. Maybe not so much for anybody that's organic, of course, but sort of established that most of you guys are pretty conventional, which is okay. I can make that recommendation. If temperatures are suitable, it's warm enough, it's above 10 degrees in your grain, and really, wait till we get warm, April, whatever, if you need to fumigate. Otherwise, you use aeration to management. But first and foremost, when you're using fumigation, be safe, okay? Take care of yourself.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you at Manitoba Ag Days 2018 from January 16th to 18th.